Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Illuminating Primary Care podcast. My name is Patrick Flowers. I'm a senior consultant at Menlo Park, and I'm joined by.
I'm David Murphy, another one of the senior consultants.
We're going to have a bit of a chat about salary and contract negotiations today. I appreciate it's a minefield, and there's lots of advice out there, and you've probably heard lots of different things. But just to jump straight into it, a question for you first, David, I guess. What could someone expect to be paid as a newly qualified GP?
Yeah, well, we did a salary survey, which if you email us, you can request a little while ago, and what it's shown is that actually there's a huge discrepancy nationally in terms of both the workload and the salaries available. So one of the things we're trying to really kind of pinpoint is what does affect sessional rate, and there are a few sort of key points really. So workload's probably the main one. So actually, there are instances where workload can differ quite drastically from one practice to another. Some practices are on 15-minute appointments, some are on 10 minutes, some are using total triage systems. So it can vary, massively from one practice to another, and actually that can have quite a big impact on, what practices are prepared to pay. So some surgeries, might be offering, a full standard BMA contract, 25 contacts in a day, but only be paying, say, like 9,500 a session. Whereas actually, you might get other practices that have got a slightly higher workload, but still reasonable, and are offering, 10 and a half, 11, those kind of ballparks. One of the things we, identified really quickly, and something we get a lot of kind of anecdotal feedback on as well, is geography. So depending on where you are in the country, is going to have quite a big impact on what you can expect to be paid. If you're a GP living central York, for example, the salaries there are historically a lot lower than they might be in deepest darkest Lincolnshire, for example. So there can be quite a difference from one area to the other, and that's what we normally refer to as market rate. So that's kind of the market forces in a given area which kind of impact the norm for GP surgeries to be advertising and offering in local areas. Another thing to consider as well is special interests. So aside from your job in GPing and where you're based in the country, so kind of workload factors and geography. If you're doing things which are different to like say a job in GP just seeing patients, if you're doing things like LARC clinics, if you're doing MSK minor surgery, if you're coming to a practice with kind of additional bells and whistles, then actually there are probably mitigating factors there which might make it compelling to offer you more than other GPs, or maybe a little bit higher than other practices in the area, for example. And obviously, experience comes into it as well. So there are going to be, in some instances, not all, differences in experience from someone who is straight off the VTS scheme. They've come through the system and they've gone straight into GP training versus someone who might have done years as an A&E consultant. So that sometimes comes into it as well. But actually, what I'm seeing more and more frequently is that practices generally have quite a flat pay structure most of the time, but it can be that they've got tiered systems where they offer you slightly lower to start with versus slightly higher. Just on the topic, it's probably worth pointing out that as an average, is like a national average, we're seeing sessional rates of between like 10 to 10 and a half as the norm. But actually, if you look in areas, like I say, really kind of rural Lincolnshire, parts of rural Norfolk, Cornwall, Dorset, those kind of areas as well. The rates can be a lot higher as an average, just because those areas are typically a lot harder to recruit to. Have you got any, I guess, practical advice, with regards to that, Paddy, or any sort of tips you'd give?
Yeah, I think you've covered some really sensible points there. I think, like you say, the easier to recruit in areas, and sometimes more affluent areas can pay lower. So York, as an example, like you say, can be even lower than the average of 10 to 10,500. So that's all really sensible. I guess in terms of practical advice, things like discussing with your GP trainer, and also friends who also might be GPs is a really good place to start in terms of what the average is you should be expecting. The GP trainer is probably going to see it from a more experienced GP point of view and maybe know what they're paying their salaried GPs if they're a partner at that practice, for example. So good to have a more experienced head looking at it. And I guess asking friends as well. So if the friends are in different areas, be mindful, as like David said, geography massively affects the sessional rate as well. So don't necessarily compare with friends if they're in different geographies, but it's a really good place to start. If they're working in the same area as you, it's good to know what they're being paid versus the workload, and how that compares as well. Another good point would be to look at adverts locally as well. So if you have an offer from your training practice that is X amount per session, maybe look at adverts locally as well and see what they'd be paying newer GPs straight out of training too. But equally be mindful that if something is or looks too good to be true, it may well be. So if there's a practice locally to you that is paying way above what you perceive to be the market average, it may well be for a reason, whether that's really high workload, whether that's they're wanting you to be on call more so than your training practice, do extra things like special interest clinics or do more home visits. All those kind of things can mean they're paying more for a reason as well. So yeah, I'd say be realistic as well. Know what the rough market value is. Realize that there is a difference between being a registrar and then being a salaried GP. So the jump in workload is going to be significant. And also, I guess, look into things like pay rises. So whether they build in probationary review pay rises. So maybe an increasing sessional rate after your initial 3 to 6 month probation period, once you're up to speed and not needing as much support as you might do immediately. And also things like the dentist and doctors review body uplift. So some practices will uplift their GP salary in line with the DDRB recommendation every year too. So I'd probably look into those things as well.
Mm. It's probably worth touching on the contract side of things as well, because when we talk about kind of what to expect, there can be quite big differences depending on the kind of surgery you work for. So without kind of getting bogged down with too much of it, there are three main types of GP provider contracts: GMS, APMS, and PMS. The two main ones that you tend to see most frequently are going to be the GMS and the APMS. APMS stands for Alternative Provider of Medical Services. It's less common than GMS, and it's typically where either a contract's been given back by a partnership and it's gone out to tender, or it can actually be, in some instances, a new service. So if there's a new service being provided locally, it can sometimes go straight out as an APMS contract rather than a GMS. These practices can either be run by a GP partnership or an organization, but one of the sort of key things to be aware of, and just to kind of manage expectations, is that actually they're not required to offer you a BMA contract, although the BMA do recommend that it's something comparable. It's not a kind of clause within their service contract to provide that to their GPs. GMS, which I've mentioned, is what people are most kind of commonly aware of. It's the most common UK GP service contract, and it's what most people would think of as the kind of traditional GP partnership model. One of the things to be aware of with this, which is what most people are aware of and do think of when they're kind of going through negotiations, is that the employment contract they offer should be a BMA model. It's actually stipulated in the GMS terms. And typically it'll follow four key areas. So the four kind of pillars that we think of probably within the BMA contract are the continuation of service, which then has a knock-on impact on things like the sick pay, maternity and paternity pay, and also the CPD, all of which is normally outlined in like the Whitley Handbook. So what I would say is, you need to be aware of what kind of practice you're going into. If it's an organization rather than a GP partnership, it's probably going to be an APMS contract. The GP employment contract might be a little bit different. And I think that's something that a lot of GPs maybe aren't overtly aware of, and maybe something they're not considering when they're job hunting.
Yeah, I think they're all really good points, and I think it's probably worth me jumping in here and talking a bit about what the BMA recommend should be offered, because it does differ on, like David said, the type of provider contract that that practice has with the NHS. So, for example, APMS providers aren't obliged to offer the model salary GP contract. They are recommended to by the General Practice Council, but it doesn't have to be offered, so they're not obliged to as an employer. Whereas GMS contracts, and practices who hold that contract with the NHS, they need to offer a contract that is similar or no less favourable to a BMA model contract. So it may still differ, but it might differ on things like salary, because the BMA contract starts at a recommendation of around £6,700 a session. So things like that may be much higher, but things may be different, as in CPD it is one of the more common things that we see. The DDRB as well, which I mentioned earlier, does set a minimum range, which I touched on briefly there, but the sessional rate range they recommend is between 6,700 up to about 10,100. And as we mentioned
Mhm.
earlier, most practices are paying significantly more than that as well. So it's worth taking that into account if the rest of the contract does differ slightly too. Um,
Yeah.
I guess to cover that further, David, do you have any advice for people on what to do if a practice isn't offering a BMA model contract?
Yeah, and I think this is something probably we've both tackled quite a bit because, um, as you said kind of earlier, it is a bit of a minefield. I think the first thing I'd say is, don't panic if you're ever offered, if you're offered a position, you're seriously considering it, and you're offered a contract, and you go, "What's this?" Don't panic. You will see variations on the BMA contract. Despite the fact the guidance for GMS practices is quite clear on having to offer something at least as favourable as the model contract. What GMS providers will sometimes do is justify those changes, by, like you say, offering a salary which is slightly higher, but then perhaps, mitigating that against, not offering as generous a CPD allowance, for example. So there are little things like that that we see quite often. Um, are you aware of any other kind of common variations, Patrick, that might be worth having a chat about?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess kind of the main ones we see are around the four pillars that we discussed earlier, but are mainly two key areas that have slightly broader implications. So the first one would be continuation of service, I guess. So some practices will argue that they are a contractor of the NHS rather than the NHS themselves. Therefore, prior continuous service with the NHS may not be recognised, and it may just be tenure with the practice that they work to instead. The main impact this will have will be on sick pay and maternity and paternity entitlement. So if the practice only starts your tenure with the NHS when you start with them, it's going to be less immediately with then you working up to it. Whereas if they recognise previous service, then you're going to be on a full entitlement straight away. Probably the most common variation that we see, though, would be CPD.
Mm,
The standard BMA recommendation is very generous, isn't it?
mhm,
So they recommend one session per week per full-time equivalent GP. So if you're working as a 9-session full-time, as the BMA says, you should be having one CPD session every week. Most practices, I'd say, vary from the BMA contracts on this point, and a large number of practices will offer 1 week pro rata of study leave in lieu of regular CPD instead.
mhm.
So I guess I just try to understand if there are consistent changes, or if there has been an error in completing the contract from the practice's point of view. So we sometimes find this in relation to the continuation of service, where the practice um, isn't
They're just not
aware.
aware. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a lack of understanding, isn't it, more than them trying to be overtly misleading on anything. So I'd probably just check over it on that particular point,
Mhm,
um, which is usually quite easy to rectify just by notifying partners or practice management of changes to the terms in the contract they should be offering. Um,
yeah.
and I guess the best leverage is just understanding what you should be offered by doing your prior research elsewhere, but also understanding that you're being reasonable and what you're asking for is
Mhm.
okay to ask for, and that other practices might be offering it, or the practice who've offered you it should be doing something differently as well, is what I'd say.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the things to kind of point out is doing your homework, be aware of what is kind of normal, and manage your own expectations as well. So we'd always recommend, you send your contract to the BMA. It's free for members. If you've done your homework, there are two things. So they're always going to come back with some amendments. I'm almost certain if you sent them a BMA contract, they would still come back with some amendments, whether it's the phrasing of words or clarifying on points. So really don't be alarmed. It's worth just kind of going into it and try to have an understanding of what amendments they might come back with before you've even sent it. So if you send them the contract and you're aware the CPD isn't quite as per the BMA, one session full-time equivalent, for example, it's going to be sort of less alarming to you when they come back and they've highlighted various things in red to say it's not correct. So manage your own expectations, but also be reasonable with what you're getting as well. So what we find, as I said, with most practices is that they might alter things like the CPD, because the salary might be higher than, say, the BMA recommendations, and if you're aware of that, then actually it might offset it for you. It might be something you're comfortable compromising on, and there might be other things within the contract as well. And equally, again, just referring back to the APMS, if you're applying for a role with a practice, you've been offered a position, you get the contract, it's an APMS provider. The sick pay might be different, the annual leave entitlement, the study leave, they all might differ. There might be other perks that you don't get in the BMA contract, like private healthcare cover. I know that's one that quite a few providers offer now. So just be reasonable with the requests that you're asking for, but also be prepared to walk away. So as Patrick mentioned, if you've made them aware of things that you don't think are right, even if you think there are some, genuine just omissions or errors in the way the contract's been put together, then be prepared to kind of walk away if they're, not compromising on things that, are really important to you. And if you're aware of what the changes might be going into it, you could save yourself some time. So if you know for a fact that, you want X, Y, and Z from your employment contract, it might deter you from applying for certain roles at certain practices if that's not quite what they're offering from the outset. I guess on the topic of salary specifically, I know we've touched on maybe what to expect, Patrick, but do you have any kind of tips on what you would do or any examples that you've come across in the past?
Yeah, so obviously salary negotiation is something that we deal a lot with, isn't it, day to day? I think it's always going to be one of those points where people are always going to want as much money as possible, and the practice are going to offer what they feel is fair as well. So I guess you want to go into negotiations with the strongest position possible, and I think the first thing you can do to ensure that is do your due diligence. First of all, if you've got some stats of what other practices are paying locally versus what they're expecting from you and what their benefits are, I think that puts you in a strong position to be able to negotiate if you're being offered what you think is under market rate. And again, understanding market rate is such an important factor, and you can do that by looking at job boards like Pulse, GP Online, BMJ, NHS Jobs, your local LMC, speaking to people locally, or even speaking to us. We have really good local knowledge in every area that we operate in. So if you want to know kind of what the local average is of sessional rate versus workload, have a chat with us about it. It's also, I guess, worth understanding a bit of context about what kind of pay system the practice operate, as in, do they pay a flat rate? So regardless of experience, is everyone being paid the same rate? So therefore, if they do, the offer probably isn't going to change because they'd have to change everyone's. Or do they have a tiered pay system where newer GPs might start on a slightly lower rate, and then experienced GPs will kind of work their way up to a higher rate to reflect experience and time within the NHS as well. Also, make sure you're asking about things like pay following probation period too, and whether that goes up once you're more confident. And also, obviously, be asking about things like does the practice follow the DDRB recommendations, because that's been 4.5% and 2% in previous years too. So that's a fairly big point as well.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any tips, David, on how a person might negotiate or broach negotiations with a practice in the first instance?
Yeah, and I think this is partly going to depend on your route to offer, because if you've come via us, for example, one of the things I know all of our team are really hot on is coaching practices, because it can be a bit of an unknown entity really for practices as well. If they've not recruited for a while, or they don't they've not kind of refined their recruitment process, it can be a bit hit and miss. Um, and one of the things that we're always trying to do, as I'm sure you know, is coaching practices on putting their best offer forward first time. And there are a few really sort of quite obvious benefits to that. It increases the likelihood of someone accepting the job to start with, and it also removes the need for any kind of awkward negotiation. It builds rapport, it builds trust because for a fact the practice is coming forward with something, first time that's good. It's a strong offer, and you're going to feel valued from it. What I would say is, negotiation doesn't have to be awkward though. So it can feel a bit uncomfortable. And I think you need to understand your motivation for wanting to negotiate. Um, Obviously, try and empathize and understand why a practice might be offering what they are. If it's lower than you may be expecting or lower than some of the neighboring practices locally, are they offering anything over and above what you might usually expect? Any really kind of hands-on mentoring, additional CPD, 15-minute appointments. Is the workload below average? Or equally, just stuff like they might not have recruited for a while, so they might just be out of touch with what GPs are asking for locally, what other practices are offering. And that's not necessarily the practice's fault. It's just a case of, if you're aware of that and you can, signpost them to places where they can, see that themselves. It's probably going to be a more warm conversation trying to get them to increase the salary because you're not doing it out of greed. It's purely based on kind of market rate and what is typically being demanded in a local area, and things like that don't have to be awkward, but it's obviously just about putting everything in context, and kind of approaching it in the right way with the practice. I'd say you going into that need to kind of prepare your facts and figures, from the research you've done on other comparable roles or any advice you had from people like us. And I say that's kind of key, because there are a lot of conversations I've had, and I know you've had the same conversations, Patrick, where
Yeah.
people are just plucking figures out of thin air, or they go, "My friend's been offered this," or "I've seen this advertised somewhere else." And actually, I think it's quite important to call people out on that sometimes because it kind of stokes unrealistic expectations, um, and isn't beneficial to anyone. It's not beneficial to you as a candidate going in and going, I'm newly qualified. I've seen adverts for £14,000 a session, you know, somewhere in the middle of nowhere. It doesn't look like you've done your homework. It doesn't particularly, make you look fantastic in that setting. So I think you've got to be really diligent in terms of preparing your facts, and going in with something that you think is reasonable. I also think you've got to highlight your interest in the position when you negotiate. Um, you know, I think you've genuinely got to want what they're offering, as a package in terms of the workload and the people and the location, to go into a negotiation honestly when you're looking at things like the salary or any other factors relating to the contract, for example. Because one of the things, I guess my next point is that acceptance and that interest in the position is really, really good leverage, to try and achieve some of the points that you're trying to get to. And it doesn't have to be done in like a totalitarian way. It doesn't have to be like a give me this or I won't accept. But actually, if you can highlight your interest in the position, thank a practice for the time they've spent with you so far, and actually say, if we can get close, or if we can get A, B, and C, I'll accept the role. Or I'm really looking forward to joining the practice. It's a really good motivator for the surgery to maybe compromise on some of the things they might not have otherwise.
Yeah.
And I think that would be my main tip, I guess, a really useful negotiation tool. Um, are there any things you'd suggest avoiding, Patrick, in negotiation, apart from maybe the ones I've mentioned?
Yeah, I think plenty. I think we've seen some awful negotiation tactics over the years, unfortunately. So I guess the first thing to mention would be that negotiation is about compromise from both parties. So it is a give and take scenario where you might want something extra, and the practice is willing to give that up, but they might want something extra from you as well. So be well aware that it's not just the practice who are giving everything away. Be prepared to be reasonable, I guess. As David mentioned, having your acceptance as some leverage can help, but it's probably right to do this in good faith. We've seen lots of situations where this hasn't been the case, but I think that if you're using your acceptance of a proposed salary or some proposed extra benefits as leverage, accepting it is probably the best thing to do from there onwards. Using acceptance as leverage and then not accepting a role is exceptionally bad form. And primary care is such a small world. You will find out that everyone knows everyone. So not burning bridges and being decent with people is probably the best tip we could ever give you.
Mhm.
Similarly, don't quote a friend's salary or an offer from a different area. It's entirely irrelevant. If you've got a friend working, like David said, in the middle of Lincolnshire, where they're being offered an insane amount of money, and you're living in central Birmingham, don't expect to be paid the same. Market rates are entirely different. Don't quote it to the practice. It's not relevant to negotiation. And I guess the final thing would be to just not accept an offer based purely on the highest salary you can find.
Yeah,
We have a bit of a phrase for this, don't we, in recruitment called golden handcuffs, where you're being
great
paid
phrase.
to. It is a great phrase, and it essentially means that you're being paid too much to leave, where you can end up trapped in a
Yeah.
job that you're being paid so much money, so significantly above the market rate, that you're then earning too much to work anywhere else. Um, and it
Yeah,
often,
the danger
yeah,
is you build your life around it, isn't it? You join
yeah,
somewhere on a crazy high salary, and it's kind of that golden handcuffs, or even danger money is another popular phrase.
yeah.
If you're in a practice where you've got one partner, who's nearing retirement, and you're the only salary GP, yeah, they're probably going to be paying a hell of a lot more than other practices in the local area. But is it sensible? Should you live within those means perpetually? Probably not.
That's it, and
uh,
it has a knock-on effect to everything else, doesn't it? If
yeah,
you take a huge salary, get a huge mortgage, a nice flash car, you're probably not
yeah,
then going to want to leave that job or be able to leave that job somewhere where you might be happier. So you kind of can end up being quite stuck there.
yeah, definitely.
So yeah, that's probably what I'd say not to do. Um, so that's probably all we've got time to cover today, I imagine.
Yeah,
Um, Hopefully a fairly comprehensive look into what to do, what not to do. If you would like to chat with us in more detail, feel free to give us a call. All our details will be in the description. And follow for more Illuminating Primary Care podcasts too.
cool. All right, bye.